No one screamed when it happened, because on this land, screaming never changed anything. Pain was normal here. Silence was survival. They owned the land. They owned the law. And they believed they owned every human breath that touched this soil. Two rich brothers ruled this plantation like gods who never feared judgment. They laughed easily. They punished casually. And they never imagined that one ordinary morning, one broken woman, would awaken something this land had never faced before, because the most dangerous moment in history is when cruelty feels safe. No one noticed the small cries at first. They were buried under the heat of the sun, under the rhythmic sounds of labor, under the constant orders barked by the overseers. On this plantation, noise was normal and pain was expected. The two brothers walked through the fields with an air of untouchable authority, their boots stamping into the hard, dry soil, their shadows long and sharp under the merciless sun. They were men who had been taught that wealth and birthright gave them dominion over every living thing on this earth. And for them it was true. No one challenged them, no one dared. They believed that power was absolute because it had never been questioned. It was a quiet confidence, born of privilege and arrogance, and it seeped into the very air around them, heavy and suffocating. Among the workers, the mother moved quietly, her hands blistered and worn, her feet raw from the endless march across the plantation. Her body carried the scars of years spent under the lash, and yet her spirit had not completely broken. She was careful not to draw attention, to remain just another shadow blending into the vast green fields. Her son was elsewhere, working under the guise of distance, unaware of the specific horrors of that day, yet connected to her pain in ways he could not fully express. She carried every insult, every blow, every whispered curse, like a private ledger of suffering that no one else could read. And in that ledger, the most important entry was not her pain, it was her hope, fragile and secret, that someday her child would not endure what she had endured. The brothers saw her not as a human being, but as an extension of the soil, something to be used, shaped, controlled. They approached her casually, as though approaching an object they could manipulate. The crack of a whip against the back of another worker, or the sharp command to bend lower in the heat of labor, was their entertainment, their assertion of dominance. They did not stop to think, to feel, or to measure the cost of each strike. Pain, to them, was inconsequential. It was a tool, and it was wielded with precision and cruelty. Yet they did not understand that cruelty, when consistent, accumulates. It seeps into the hearts of those who are harmed, quietly shaping responses, planting seeds that may one day sprout into forces beyond anyone's control. She knelt in the mud as a punishment for a minor misstep, her palms pressed against the hard, cold earth, her face streaked with sweat, tears, and dirt. The brothers laughed at her, enjoying the spectacle as though it were theater. But she was not invisible, she was not powerless. Every ounce of her being focused on survival, on breathing, on keeping her son's future alive in her mind, even as her present was filled with suffering. Her prayers were silent but potent, whispered under her breath, a plea for mercy, a plea for endurance, a plea that her son would one day walk freely in a world where cruelty would not touch him. It was a prayer that required no words because it was more than words. It was a vow embedded into the marrow of her being, a signal that the legacy of her suffering would not define the next generation. Her son, miles away yet intimately connected to her anguish, sensed something was amiss. He could not hear her cries, but he felt the shift, the tremor of fear that traveled invisibly across the distance. There was a heaviness that settled into his chest, a tug that he could not explain. Deaf to the audible world, he had developed a sense of awareness that surpassed what most could imagine. He knew in a way that defied logic that something was wrong, that the delicate balance of their lives was tipping toward catastrophe. It was as if the world itself was whispering to him, calling him home, urging him to step into a destiny that he had not yet fully understood. The journey back was not merely a physical return, but a movement laden with purpose. Each step carried the weight of anticipation and dread. He understood instinctively that what awaited him was more than a confrontation. It was a reckoning. On the fields, the wind carried smells, sounds, and vibrations that told stories the hearing could not catch. And slowly, inexorably, the tension built, unspoken but tangible, like the gathering of storm clouds over a parched land. When he approached the plantation, the air itself seemed to pause, the workers holding the ear breath, the birds falling silent, and even the earth beneath his feet seeming to acknowledge the arrival of something formidable, unstoppable, transformative. The brothers did not notice the shift at first. Their arrogance was too deeply ingrained. They continued their cruel routines, unaware that the rules of power were about to change in ways they could not anticipate. But as his massive form emerged on the horizon, as he stepped into the spaces they had long dominated, everything altered. Shadows lengthened, expressions changed, and for the first time, fear entered a place that had known nothing but confidence. The muscles in his arms were coiled with quiet intensity. His presence alone radiated strength and inevitability, and every movement carried the weight of the years of injustice his mother had endured. Power, once absolute in their minds, now wavered. They attempted to laugh, to command, to assert control, but the air around them had shifted too profoundly. Words stumbled, authority faltered, and every gesture of dominance became uncertain, vulnerable. They had never faced a force that did not bend, a presence that did not fear them, a soul aligned with justice beyond vengeance. Their wealth, their status, their history, all of it felt fragile in the shadow of a son who carried more than size. He carried purpose, love, and the undeniable moral weight of every wrong inflicted upon his mother. And in that realization, the foundations of their world began to crumble. He spoke no words. He needed none. The language of power, pain, and love transcended speech. His eyes, fierce and unrelenting, told a story of suffering, of endurance, and of the quiet accumulation of strength over years of injustice. Every step he took, every breath he drew, communicated that cruelty had limits, that oppression had consequences, that the world would not remain silent forever. The brothers understood this in an instant. What they had considered entertainment, what they had dismissed as inconsequential, was now confronted with an undeniable force, a living testament to the power that grows in silence, to the reckoning that comes when the oppressed rise without warning. History watches moments like these quietly. It does not always roar in newspapers or books. Sometimes it whispers in the soil, in the air, in the memory of those who survive. In this moment, the mother's endurance, the son's arrival, and the brother's realization all converged into a scene that would be remembered not for violence alone but for truth. For once, cruelty encountered its limit. For once, suffering was met with the potential for justice, not through noise or chaos, but through the undeniable presence of a force born from love, from survival, from years of silent endurance. And so the plantation held its breath, the world watching quietly, as the boundaries of power shifted irreversibly. Silence had transformed into action, fear had replaced arrogance, and history had taken note in ways that could never be undone. The mother's prayer had been answered in the most profound way possible, not through the destruction of her oppressors alone, but through the emergence of a force capable of changing the narrative, capable of rewriting what it meant to be powerful in a world built on fear and greed. In that quiet revolution, the essence of resilience was revealed, and the stage was set for everything that would follow. No one could have imagined that a day like this could begin so quietly. The sun had barely risen, and yet the air was already thick with tension, invisible but undeniable. The fields stretched endlessly, green and gold under the soft morning light, but beneath that beauty lay a network of fear, discipline, and the relentless weight of expectation. Workers moved with precision, almost mechanical, carrying tools, baskets, and burdens they had learned to bear without complaint. The overseers walked among them like predators, their eyes sharp, their presence a constant reminder of the consequences of defiance. And somewhere in the middle of all this, she moved with a quiet grace that betrayed nothing of the storm inside her. She had learned to survive by becoming almost invisible, by blending into the background while carrying every burden silently. Each strike of a whip or cruel word chipped at her body, yes, but it also carved lessons into her mind, lessons of endurance, patience, and the subtle art of survival. She had become an expert at hiding pain in plain sight, a master at holding her heart close while giving just enough to appear compliant. The plantation demanded obedience, and she had long since learned that outward compliance could shield her inner strength. Every careful movement, every suppressed breath, was a strategy designed to protect not herself, but the only part of her life that mattered, her son. Far away, her son could sense that something was off. Though deaf to the world's sounds, he was attuned to the rhythms of life, the subtleties of human emotion that others failed to notice. There was a heaviness in the air, an almost imperceptible tension that tugged at his instincts. It was as though the plantation itself was calling him home, whispering of injustices he had not yet seen but somehow already understood. Each step toward his mother was heavy with anticipation and dread, yet propelled by a force stronger than fear, a combination of love, loyalty, and the quiet promise that what had been broken would be repaired, or at least confronted. The two brothers, unaware of the storm that was approaching, carried on with their usual cruelty. They moved with confidence, their arrogance as natural as the morning sun. Orders were shouted, lashes cracked, and laughter echoed across the fields. To them, the world existed only to reflect their dominance. Yet within that laughter, there was a subtle crack, unnoticed by anyone but the keenest observers. The power they wielded so casually had been built on unquestioned obedience, and obedience depends on belief. When belief falters, even the most confident tyrants can be shaken, and that day, the first cracks had already begun to appear. The mother's resolve remained unbroken, though her body bore the scars of years of oppression. Every humiliation, every moment of pain, had strengthened her in ways that were invisible to the world but palpable to those who could perceive true courage. Her prayers were quiet but constant, whispered in the privacy of her mind, a plea for endurance, a plea for protection, a plea that her son would one day confront the injustice he had been shielded from, but which he was destined to face. She did not wish for destruction. She wished for recognition, for justice, for the restoration of dignity that had been denied to her and countless others before her. As her son drew closer, the plantation seemed to hold its breath. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, the wind shifted, and the usual sounds of labor were muted, as though the land itself anticipated what was coming. His towering figure, silent and purposeful, became a harbinger of change. Every step he took resonated with the weight of years spent watching, learning, and enduring. Though he had grown in silence, his presence now spoke volumes. The balance of power, so long maintained by fear and wealth, began to wobble under the simple force of his existence. For the first time, the brothers' supremacy was not absolute. It was fragile, dependent on assumptions that no longer held true. The moment of confrontation drew closer, yet he spoke no words. Words were unnecessary. History, pain, and love had taught him that actions carry more weight than commands or curses. The brothers, still blind to the magnitude of what was approaching, continued their daily rituals of control, unaware that the very presence of his body challenged every notion of authority they held. The air itself seemed charged, electric with anticipation. Workers sensed it too, some pausing mid-task, their hearts pounding in silent recognition that a shift was occurring, though none fully understood its implications. When he finally appeared in full view, the transformation was immediate. The laughter ceased, orders faltered, and the confidence that had defined the brothers' existence evaporated almost instantly. What they had dismissed as insignificant, this silent, imposing figure, was in fact the culmination of every act of cruelty they had inflicted. They had trained Obed, Ayans into fear, but they had not anticipated courage bred in silence, strength nurtured through suffering, or the quiet inevitability of justice finally arriving in its human form. In that moment, they realized that dominance is not granted by wealth or status, but maintained only as long as it is unchallenged. Her son did not strike immediately. He did not need to. The weight of his presence, the intensity of his gaze, the unspoken message carried in every line of his body, communicated more than any threat could. He embodied the consequence of every cruel act, every whispered insult, every stolen moment of dignity. And in his eyes, the brothers saw not hatred alone, but a profound understanding of justice, one that would be meted out according to the rules of the world that had ignored mercy for so long. The realization was suffocating, inescapable, and irreversible. The balance had shifted, and they could not deny it. History records few moments as vividly as this, not because of the spectacle, but because of the moral clarity it contains. A mother's endurance, a son's awakening, and the fallibility of those who abuse power converge in a scene that demonstrates the limits of cruelty. The plantation, once a symbol of absolute authority, had become a witness to inevitability. Silence had transformed into presence. Fear had replaced arrogance, and the invisible hand of justice, long dormant, had finally moved. What had been suppressed for decades was now undeniable, and every observer, willing or unwilling, understood that something fundamental had changed forever. The brothers attempted to reclaim control, but the ground had shifted beneath their feet. Commands fell flat. Threats lacked credibility, and every action felt muted against the force of inevitability standing before them. The workers watched in awe and silent hope, recognizing for the first time that strength could emerge from endurance, that justice could manifest quietly but irresistibly, and that the consequences of cruelty were neither distant nor avoidable. The son's approach was more than a physical presence. It was a statement, a lesson, and a warning woven into the fabric of a history that had too often ignored the voices of the oppressed. By the end of the day, the plantation was no longer the same. The hierarchy had been challenged, the illusions of invincibility shattered, and the air itself carried the weight of new understanding. The mother's prayers had not gone unanswered. Her endurance had been vindicated, and the son, silent yet unyielding, had become the embodiment of a force that few could resist, the inevitable reckoning of years of suffering, tempered with love, focused through patience, and delivered with precision. This moment would not fade quietly into memory. It would resonate through the lives of everyone present, shaping history in ways subtle yet profound. The sun dipped lower in the sky, but the plantation remained alive with the sounds of forced labor and whispered fear. Even as shadows grew long, the air felt heavier, charged with tension that no one yet fully understood. The two brothers moved among the workers with their usual casual arrogance, unaware that everything they had built on domination and intimidation was beginning to unravel. Every glance, every command, every lash had been designed to assert control, yet now it only highlighted vulnerability. They did not yet know it, but the foundations of their power were cracking. A single presence, long absent but quietly growing, had begun to challenge the unquestionable order they had always relied upon. The mother continued her work, stoic and composed, though her body bore the weight of years of abuse. Every movement was calculated, deliberate, a study in survival under the harshest conditions. She had learned to shield her inner strength behind the facade of obedience, but her eyes still held stories of endurance, pain, and unspoken defiance. In those quiet, fleeting moments when no one watched, she allowed herself to imagine a world in which her suffering would be acknowledged, a world in which her son could stand without fear, and where justice could arrive without ceremony but with undeniable power. Those fleeting imaginings sustained her, gave her a sense of purpose, and fed a growing invisible flame that no amount of cruelty could extinguish. The brothers, confident in their untouchable status, carried on their cruel entertainment as usual. They delighted in humiliating her, turning her suffering into sport. They did not see her as a human being with thoughts, feelings, or aspirations. To them, she was an object, a plaything, a canvas upon which to project their dominance. Yet cruelty, repeated and unchecked, has a subtle way of inviting consequences. It embeds itself into the consciousness of the oppressed, not just as pain, but as knowledge. Knowledge of what must one day be confronted, of what must be addressed, and of the power that can emerge when endurance meets opportunity. And though they laughed, they were sowing the seeds of a reckoning they could not yet imagine. She fell to her knees again that afternoon, mud and sweat clinging to her body. The brothers laughed, relishing the scene, but in her mind, a silent calculation was taking shape. Every blow, every insult, every cruel jest was being catalogued, not for vengeance, at least not yet, but for understanding. She knew the terrain of power here intimately. She knew the weaknesses hidden behind bluster. She knew the psychology of men who had never been challenged, who assumed that fear could be forced into submission indefinitely, and she prayed, not for herself, but for the son who would one day arrive to measure those assumptions against a reality he had been trained to confront in silence, in strength, and in moral clarity. Far away, her son could sense it. Though unable to hear, he felt the rhythms of the plantation in ways others could not. The vibrations of the ground, the tension in the air, the body language of those moving among him. They all told a story. Something was wrong. Something that demanded his attention, that pulled him inexorably toward the place he had tried to remain distant from, toward the epicenter of suffering he could no longer ignore. Instinct and awareness drove him forward, step by step, heart pounding not with fear, but with purpose, every fiber of his being aligned with what was about to occur. It was a force older and deeper than anger. It was justice, long delayed but inevitable. As he drew closer, the plantation seemed to shift around him. Workers paused mid-task, sensing the approaching presence of something immense, something that would not allow injustice to continue unchecked. The brothers, still blind in their arrogance, continued their routines, oblivious to the storm they were about to face. But the air itself had begun to hum with tension, thick and tangible, carrying with it a warning that was impossible to ignore. Power, they would soon learn, is not simply a matter of wealth or physical control. It is a fragile construct, dependent on the belief of those subjected to it. When belief falters, even the strongest tyrants can collapse under pressure they never anticipated. When he finally arrived, there was a moment that seemed to suspend time. His presence alone altered the dynamics of the plantation. The brothers looked up, caught between disbelief and fear. They had never seen him like this. Not silent, not deaf, not yet fully realized, but fully formidable. He did not need to speak. His sheer size, the intensity of his gaze, and the authority inherent in every movement communicated more than words ever could. Every lash, every shout, every act of cruelty they had inflicted now met with the silent weight of consequence. A reminder that suffering, when long endured, cultivates a power that cannot be easily ignored or dismissed. The workers watched, riveted and silent. For years they had endured abuse and humiliation, believing that submission was the only safe path. Now they witnessed the embodiment of resistance. One figure carried the collective weight of suffering and resilience, and the message was unmistakable. Cruelty has limits, oppression has consequences, and the world will eventually respond to injustice in ways that are profound, unavoidable, and transformative. The sun's arrival was not merely a confrontation. It was a lesson written in presence, in timing, and the quiet inevitability of retribution. The brothers attempted to assert control. They shouted, gestured, tried to re-establish their dominance, but each action faltered under the gravity of his gaze. Confidence, once unshakable, was now tentative. Every move they made was measured against the invisible calculus of consequence, the moral weight that had been accumulating silently over years. They had ruled without question, and now, faced with unyielding presence, their assumptions crumbled. The plantation, once a theater of cruelty and unchallenged authority, became a stage for reckoning, a canvas on which endurance, justice, and moral truth painted their unmistakable narrative. Her son did not need to strike to communicate his message. Every step, every breath, every subtle motion conveyed the consequences of cruelty, the power of enduring love, and the moral authority of one who has observed injustice and survived it. In that moment, history seemed to pause. The oppressive order of the plantation, long assumed unbreakable, had encountered a force it could neither anticipate nor control. Fear replaced arrogance, respect replaced casual cruelty, and the lesson was clear. The oppressed, when armed with patience, observation, and purpose, can change the world without uttering a single word. By nightfall, the atmosphere had transformed completely. The plantation, once defined by hierarchy and submission, now held the echoes of awakening. The mother's endurance had been validated, her silent prayers answered through the very presence of her son. The brothers had been forced to confront the limits of their power and the consequences of their actions in a way that was undeniable, and morally instructive. And for the workers, the lesson was profound. Strength does not always arrive in noise. Sometimes it comes silently, steadily, and unrelentingly, reshaping the very landscape of fear and obedience. And strength is still quiet. Plantation's air had grown heavy with anticipation by early afternoon, thick as the humidity that clung to every surface. Even the birds seemed to sense the change, their chirps muted, their wings hesitant against the sun-drenched sky. The workers moved slowly, their motions uneasy, glances cast furtively at one another as though they feared that their very thoughts might betray what they sensed approaching. For years, obedience had been survival, and habit had reinforced silence, but something in the wind hinted at disruption, a silent but palpable presence that demanded acknowledgement. Even the earth beneath their feet seemed to hum with tension, vibrating as if aware of the reckoning that loomed closer. The mother knelt again in the mud that afternoon, her body aching from relentless labor and the repeated humiliation of public punishment. Her face bore sweat, tears, and dirt, a testament to the cruelty that had been a constant companion for so long. And yet, beneath the surface of exhaustion, there was an undeniable fire. Every moment she spent under the lash, every insult absorbed, every whispered jest at her expense, strengthened the quiet, simmering resolve within her. She had learned that outward compliance could conceal an inner fortress. Each silent prayer she offered carried not just hope, but a blueprint for endurance, an unspoken strategy that would one day bring justice to those who had assumed they could do as they pleased. The brothers, oblivious to the gathering tension, continued their performances of dominance. Their cruelty was a game, rehearsed and predictable, yet dangerous because no one dared to interrupt it. They relished in humiliation, not for practical purposes, but for amusement, for the ego boost of demonstrating power unchecked. To them, the mother was a character in their story, a canvas upon which they projected superiority. They could not see the currents of consequence weaving around them, the ripples of injustice ready to crash back in forms they had never considered. Arrogance blinded them to the inevitability building quietly, steadily, and with precision. Far away, the sun moved with the deliberate care of one attuned to forces beyond ordinary perception. Deaf to the audible world, he perceived rhythm, tension, and vibration with a sensitivity honed over years. He felt the subtle tremors of distress in the plantation, each one pulling him inexorably forward. Every instinct, every muscle seemed preordained, moving him toward confrontation that was less an act of choice than a fulfillment of destiny. The air around him carried warnings, and he read them as clearly as any message written in ink. Step by step, he approached the epicenter of cruelty, driven not by anger, but by a profound sense of purpose, to witness, to stand, and ultimately, to correct. The plantation workers paused mid-task as he drew near. Their eyes widened, their bodies stiffened. They had grown used to routine oppression, to the comforting predictability of subjugation. Now, in his approach, they saw an unmistakable symbol of resistance. This was not a man bent by fear or timidity. This was a presence calibrated by endurance, refined by suffering, and informed by intimate knowledge of the injustices inflicted here for generations. Hope flickered in their hearts as they watched, tentative but real. Finally, someone had arrived who embodied what they had longed for, a force unbroken, undeniable, and poised to restore balance. The brothers remained initially unaware of the gravity of the moment. They continued their cruel commands, expecting compliance and fear to maintain the equilibrium of power. But subtle signs, imperceptible to most, began to erode their certainty. The air felt different. Shadows moved differently. Even their own reflections, in the beads of sweat on their skin, seemed to betray a change in circumstance. The confidence that had sustained them for so long began to falter, and unease slithered into their awareness. Arrogance, once an impenetrable shield, had cracks, and in those cracks, consequence waited, patient, silent, and precise. When the sun finally appeared fully in view, the plantation seemed to bend around him. The balance of authority, once so absolute, shifted in the weight of his presence alone. The brothers' eyes widened. Confidence gave way to disbelief, then fear. The body of the sun, immense and coiled with quiet strength, conveyed the moral reckoning of countless acts of cruelty. No words were necessary. Each stride, each flex of muscle, each deliberate breath communicated the reality they had ignored. The oppressed, when patient, observant, and enduring, could become an unstoppable force. Their wealth and social status were insufficient shields against the truth now before them. The mother's gaze lifted from the ground as she noticed him, her heart both relieved and tense. Years of silent suffering converged in this single moment. The prayers she had whispered for him, the hope she had held like a secret talisman, were realized in his form. He was the embodiment of her resilience, of her foresight, and of the moral clarity that comes from long experience of injustice. In his presence, cruelty could no longer masquerade as authority, and every act of humiliation previously inflicted on her took on new meaning, not as triumphs for the oppressors, but as catalysts for this impending justice. The workers observed silently, almost holding their breath. Their lives had been defined by fear, and now, for the first time, they perceived possibility. The oppressive narrative of obedience and submission was being rewritten before their eyes. The sun's arrival communicated more than power. It communicated inevitability. It reminded everyone present that endurance builds strength, that suffering is not meaningless, and that acts of cruelty, no matter how long ignored, have consequences that can arrive with a force far beyond expectation. The air was thick with tension, almost unbearable, as time seemed to stretch, holding everyone in suspense. The brothers attempted to restore their dominance. Their commands were sharper, their gestures exaggerated, their voices raised. But each attempt faltered under the weight of presence. Authority depends on belief, and belief evaporates when confronted with undeniable truth. Their laughter ceased. The certainty that had colored every day of their lives was replaced with a creeping awareness that the equilibrium they relied upon had shifted, irrevocably. They were no longer the uncontested rulers of this space. Every action, previously interpreted as unchallenged power, now exposed their vulnerability in stark relief. Even without speaking, the sun communicated volumes. His eyes carried centuries of unacknowledged pain, the quiet strength of survival, and the promise of retribution, aligned with justice, not cruelty. Every movement was deliberate, measured, and loaded with moral authority. He had observed, endured, and learned, and now he embodied the consequences of oppression in a form that was impossible to ignore. In that silent presence, the brothers and all who watched understood that a new power dynamic had taken hold. The rules of dominance were no longer theirs to dictate. By sunset, the plantation had transformed. The oppressive hierarchy, once rigid and unquestioned, had shifted under the quiet weight of inevitability. The mother's suffering had been validated in the most profound way, through the emergence of her son as both protector and symbol of enduring justice. The brothers were forced to reckon with the limits of their power, understanding that wealth and cruelty cannot indefinitely suppress the human spirit. For the workers, this was a revelation, a lesson in patience, resilience, and the quiet, relentless nature of consequence. The day ended not with violence, but with a recognition of power redefined. The plantation, once a theater of cruelty, became a testament to endurance and moral clarity. The sun's silent approach demonstrated that courage and justice often arrive quietly, but with a force that reshapes lives, perceptions, and the moral landscape itself. The air, once heavy with fear, now carried an unmistakable sense of potential. A new chapter had begun, not just for the mother, not just for her son, but for everyone who had witnessed the slow, inevitable confrontation between cruelty and endurance. The first true cracks in tyranny had appeared, and history, silent and watchful, had taken note. The morning light filtered through the dense canopy, but the plantation seemed different that day. Shadows clung to the corners of the fields with a weight they had never held before. Even the soil, baked and cracked, seemed to tremble slightly under the steps of those who moved across it. The workers whispered quietly among themselves, their voices low, almost fearful of being overheard. Fear had been their constant companion for years, a silent shadow that governed every action, every word, every glance. But now uncertainty had replaced some of that fear, and with uncertainty came a strange, fragile hope. For the first time, the familiar rhythm of labor was interrupted by something deeper, something intangible yet undeniably present. The mother worked steadily, stoic and resilient as she always did, but her heart carried the weight of knowledge. She knew that her son was on his way, that every prayer whispered in silence over the years was about to manifest in reality. Every scar on her body, every bruise etched by cruelty, every humiliation endured had not been in vain. They were the invisible markers that had prepared her child to understand the depth of injustice, to feel the pulse of suffering, and to act with a strength born of experience that was greater than mere physical power. She carried within her a legacy of survival, and it was about to meet its moment of reckoning. The brothers continued their casual cruelty, laughing as they demanded more from the workers. They were oblivious to the shift in the air, to the way eyes darted and hearts beat in silent anticipation. Their arrogance was a bubble, thick and impermeable, yet the first subtle cracks had begun to form. Every act of mockery, every flick of the wrist with a whip, had taught lessons beyond compliance. It had taught observation, endurance, and patience. And those lessons, though invisible to them, were taking shape into a force that would change the narrative entirely. The world had never accounted for what happens when silence is neither acceptance nor ignorance, but preparation. Far away, the son felt the pull of his mother's pain in a way that transcended sound. Deaf to the external world, he had developed a perception sharper than any ear could provide. He sensed the shift in the rhythm of life, the tension in the earth, the quiet trembling of those who toiled beneath the sun. Step by step, he moved closer, each motion deliberate, each breath steady, carrying with it the weight of unseen centuries of injustice. It was not anger that propelled him, nor fear, nor desire for vengeance. It was recognition, a moral clarity that could not be ignored, a purpose that could not be denied. He was approaching the place where suffering had taken root, and he would confront it in a way history would remember. The workers paused in their labor, a collective, silent acknowledgement of the change that had come. They had endured so much, and yet their endurance had been shaping something beyond the understanding of the oppressors. The mother had taught, through her silence, and resilience, that suffering alone was not enough to break the human spirit. The son's approach was proof of this truth, a tangible manifestation of years of quiet observation, patience, and endurance. It was as though the plantation itself recognized that the balance of power was about to shift, and even the earth seemed to bend toward this inevitable reckoning. The brothers finally noticed him as he entered the fields. The first reaction was disbelief, followed by confusion, then fear, a fear they had never experienced. They had assumed obedience was eternal, that their dominance would never be questioned. But the figure approaching them was not just a man, it was the embodiment of all they had taken for granted. Towering, muscular, silent, and deliberate, he carried with him the weight of moral authority, of consequence, and of relentless justice. Every step he took seemed to compress the air around them, making every gesture, every word, every laugh feel small, fragile, and impotent. The mother lifted her gaze, seeing him fully for the first time in years. Relief, tension, and pride collided in her chest. Her prayers, whispered in secrecy, had been answered in the most profound way. This was not a random arrival. This was the culmination of endurance, of preparation, of a life lived with purpose and pain intertwined. The cruelty she had endured was finally being met with a force capable of acknowledging it fully, a presence that would not let injustice pass unchallenged. It was both terrifying and comforting, a paradox of fear and hope coexisting in the same breath. The brothers attempted to assert themselves, shouting, gesturing, trying to reclaim dominance, but effort was futile. Authority depends on belief, and belief evaporates when confronted by undeniable truth. Their arrogance, so deeply ingrained, began to falter under the intensity of a presence that had been shaped by patience, suffering, and purpose. The laughter that once echoed across the fields died in their throats, replaced by a dawning realization that the power they had always relied upon was neither absolute nor permanent. For the first time they were exposed, vulnerable, and acutely aware that they were being measured by standards beyond wealth, beyond size, beyond fear. The son did not need to speak. Words would have diminished the weight of his presence. His eyes, steady and unyielding, conveyed the reality of every act of oppression committed against his mother, against the workers, against anyone who had ever dared to hope silently. Every glance carried history, pain, and moral clarity, a testament to endurance and resilience that could not be ignored. The brothers saw themselves not as powerful men but as fragile, fallible humans, confronted with the consequences of their arrogance in real time. Their understanding of authority, until now unquestioned, had been shattered. By the end of the day, the plantation had shifted profoundly. The oppressive hierarchy had been disrupted, the illusion of invincibility dismantled. The workers saw in the sun a living proof that endurance, patience, and silent strength could confront cruelty effectively. The mother's silent suffering had been validated, her prayers answered, and the sun's presence had created a tangible recalibration of power. No words were needed, no battle fought. The quiet, deliberate arrival had already rewritten the dynamics. The landscape of fear had been redefined, and history itself seemed to pause to acknowledge the transformation. That evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the fields, a new order seemed possible, not one dictated by fear or cruelty, but by understanding, resilience, and the moral authority of those who have endured and observed. The mother watched, exhausted yet unbroken, and realized that the reckoning she had hoped for had begun. The sun's silent presence carried a force stronger than any whip, any insult, any act of wealth-driven dominance. It was a presence that reminded everyone, worker, oppressor, and observer alike, that endurance breeds strength, patience cultivates power, and justice, even delayed, is inevitable. The first cracks in tyranny had appeared, subtle but irreversible. Fear, once a tool of the powerful, had begun to circulate in new directions. Arrogance had met its match in the unspoken weight of consequence, and the mother understood, with quiet certainty, that this was only the beginning. History was watching, silently, patiently, and the stage was set for every act of cruelty to be measured against the force of endurance that had finally, at last, arrived. The sun barely pierced the morning haze, casting long, ghostly shadows over the plantation. The air was heavy, thick with anticipation, and even the birds seemed hesitant to disturb the silence. The workers moved with mechanical precision, but their hearts were alive with an unspoken tension, their eyes darting toward the horizon as though expecting an impossible change. Fear had long been their companion, but something had shifted. The rhythm of oppression that had once governed every breath now felt fragile, uncertain. Something immense was approaching, something that would not bend to cruelty, something that would expose every lie the tyrants had relied upon. The mother moved among the rows of laborers with her usual calm exterior, but beneath it was a storm. Years of suffering had honed her into a master of quiet endurance. Every lash she had received, every insult whispered in front of witnesses, had been catalogued, stored in the deep recesses of her mind, a blueprint for the day when justice, however slow, would arrive. She did not harbor hatred for the brothers, she harbored understanding. She knew that cruelty often breeds arrogance, and that arrogance, when confronted with inevitability, becomes fragile. And she prayed, not for revenge, but for her son to arrive with the clarity, strength, and purpose required to reshape the balance of power. Far from the fields, her son moved with deliberate, controlled steps. Deaf to the world's sounds, he felt its rhythm in ways few could. The vibrations of the earth, the subtleties in the air, the movements of the laborers, all told a story he could read without a single word. Each sensation drove him forward, each heartbeat aligned with purpose. He was approaching not out of rage, but out of inevitability, a moral clarity that had been shaped by observation, patience, and endurance. What awaited him was not a fight of brute force, but a reckoning long overdue, a confrontation that had been written in the patterns of suffering he had spent years decoding. The brothers, unaware of the approaching storm, continued their cruel routines. They mocked the laborers, wielded their power like a performance, and assumed their control was absolute. To them, fear was eternal, obedience a given, and punishment unquestioned. Yet, arrogance blinds the powerful. They could not perceive the subtle tremors that foreshadowed the collapse of their dominance. Every act of mockery, every whip, Every command had been shaping a force beyond their comprehension, a force grounded not in brute strength, but in endurance, intelligence, and the moral weight of injustice endured over time. The mother paused mid-task, her hands covered in mud, sweat, and the signs of relentless labor. She allowed herself a moment to imagine her son arriving, to envision the moment when years of silent endurance would finally converge into action. The anticipation was almost unbearable, yet it filled her with a strange power. She had endured for herself, for her child, and for every laborer who had ever bowed under fear. This moment was the culmination of patience and suffering, the proof that endurance, however quiet, carries a force the oppressors cannot see until it is too late. As the sun neared the plantation, the workers paused in unison, their movements suspended as if caught in a spell. They had long believed obedience was survival, yet now they sensed possibility. The rhythm of fear had changed. It no longer dictated the space. Their silent witness to the approaching figure gave them hope that power could be challenged, that cruelty could be exposed, and that endurance could finally manifest as action. They did not speak, they did not need to. The presence alone communicated the inevitability of change. When he entered full view, the brothers' world shifted. Their laughter ceased. Their authority faltered, and their eyes widened in disbelief. The figure before them was more than human. He was a force calibrated by years of observation, patience, and silent suffering. Each motion was deliberate, each breath controlled, each glance loaded with the accumulated weight of injustice. Their wealth and privilege, long assumed to be shields, offered no protection against this presence. Fear replaced arrogance, certainty gave way to doubt, and the rules they had relied upon for generations were stripped away in an instant. The mother's eyes met her son's for the first time in years. Relief, pride, and unspoken tension collided in her chest. Every hardship she had endured, every moment of subjugation had prepared this moment. Her silent prayers, her whispered hopes, had coalesced into a living reality. This was not simply her son returning. This was justice incarnate. His presence conveyed understanding, purpose, and a moral clarity that spoke louder than words ever could. Every act of cruelty previously inflicted was reframed in this light, not as triumphs, but as catalysts for the reckoning that had now arrived. The brothers attempted to assert dominance, their gestures sharp, voices loud, but they were impotent. Presence outweighed wealth, moral authority outweighed cruelty, and the unbroken endurance of years outstripped arrogance. Confidence crumbled in. The dawn broke unevenly, casting a pale, eerie light over the plantation. The fields, once alive with routine labor, now moved with a tentative hesitation. Even the air seemed heavier, thick with anticipation and dread. The workers' footsteps were cautious, their glances frequent, as though the very ground beneath them had changed. Years of fear had taught them obedience, but the arrival of the sun had shifted the balance. Silence was no longer submission, it was witness. Every heart on the plantation beat in quiet recognition that something monumental was unfolding, something that would redefine the very idea of power. The mother moved through the fields, her movements calm yet deliberate, her eyes scanning for any sign of further cruelty. She bore the marks of years spent surviving, scars etched deep by the hands of those who believed dominance was eternal. But her strength was not in brute force, it was in patience, in endurance, in the quiet cultivation of wisdom and moral clarity. Every lash she had absorbed, every insult endured, every whispered mockery had become a lesson in strategy, observation, and subtle power. And now that power was manifesting through her son, a living testament to the inevitability of justice. The brothers continued their ritual of dominance, yet even in their arrogance, cracks had begun to show. Orders once delivered with unchallenged authority now fell flat. The workers' hesitant movements betrayed uncertainty and an emerging awareness that the balance had shifted. The brothers laughed, trying to reclaim control, but the laughter sounded hollow, forced, fragile. They could not yet see that authority built purely on fear is inherently unstable, and that the patient endurance of the oppressed often develops into a force far more powerful than wealth, privilege, or intimidation. The son approached, each step deliberate, controlled and heavy with the weight of moral clarity. Deaf to the world's noise, he felt its rhythm, its tension, its subtle vibrations, reading each like a story written in movement and air. He was not motivated by anger, nor by desire for vengeance. He was driven by inevitability, a deep understanding of justice shaped by years of observation, endurance, and preparation. Every step drew him closer to confrontation. Yet it was not confrontation for the sake of violence. It was a reckoning of power, of arrogance, of cruelty that had been assumed permanent for far too long. The workers paused mid-task as he drew near. They had lived under oppression for so long that obedience had been second nature. Yet now, observing him, hope flickered in their hearts. It was fragile, tentative, but undeniable. They saw in him the culmination of endurance, patience, and moral clarity, the living embodiment of a force capable of challenging injustice. The subtle energy in the air shifted as they realized that fear, once absolute, had begun to bend, and courage long dormant was stirring within their silent hearts. When he finally appeared fully, the brothers froze. The arrogance they had worn like armor could not withstand the intensity of his presence. Every lash they had delivered, every insult flung, every act of cruelty, now resonated as part of a moral reckoning. The son's size, posture, and silent authority communicated volumes. He needed no words. His presence alone carried the weight of inevitability. They had believed themselves untouchable, masters of the plantation, and all who lived on it. Now they confronted the terrifying reality that power rooted in fear is fragile, and arrogance alone cannot defend against the force of enduring strength. The mother's gaze lifted fully, meeting her son's eye. For the first time after years of separation. Relief, awe, and profound pride surged through her. Years of suffering, quiet endurance, and whispered prayers had all led to this moment. Her son was more than a protector. He was the embodiment of patience, strength, and justice. He carried the collective weight of every humiliation she had endured and every injustice witnessed by the workers, a weight that demanded recognition and recalibration. The cruelty they had assumed permanent now faced an undeniable presence, calibrated with precision and inevitability. The brothers tried again to reassert control, issuing sharp commands and threats, gesturing with exaggerated authority, but each attempt faltered. Presence outweighed dominance, moral clarity outweighed arrogance, and the unbroken endurance of years made their attempts impotent. Their certainty, so long assumed, had dissolved. The plantation, once a theater of unquestioned authority, had become a stage for reckoning. The workers, silently witnessing this transformation, felt their own spirits lift. The son's deliberate approach communicated that courage and moral authority could manifest quietly, yet with an unstoppable force. By midday, the tension was palpable. The plantation seemed to breathe differently. Each shadow, each rustle of leaves, each muted sound resonating with the anticipation of change. The son's presence was more than physical. It was symbolic. It communicated the inevitability of consequence, the enduring power of patience and moral clarity, and the ultimate fragility of cruelty built solely on fear. The brothers, finally realizing the depth of the shift, were forced to confront not just the strength of his body, but the authority of endurance, observation, and moral inevitability. The mother, her body aching but spirit resolute, observed the slow unfolding of justice. Years of silent suffering, hidden endurance, and unspoken prayers had culminated in this moment. Every act of cruelty inflicted upon her had prepared the soil for this reckoning. The son, steady and deliberate, was the instrument of that culmination. For the workers, this was proof that suffering, patience, and quiet strength could challenge even the most entrenched hierarchies. The air was charged, thick with the electricity of awakening, and the first irreversible cracks in tyranny had deepened. By evening, the plantation had been irrevocably changed. The hierarchy, once rigid and unquestioned, had shifted under the quiet weight of moral inevitability. The mother's endurance had been validated, her prayers answered. The son had become both a guardian and